cousin Dana stood at the head of the conference table like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. She had that look, the one she used to wear at family dinners when she was about to say something that would make everyone go quiet. Except this time, she was wearing a badge and a tailored blazer, and the room held 31 federal employees, and the thing she was about to say was going to end my career. Or so she thought. I want to go back a little, because none of this makes sense without knowing who Dana is and who I am, and how two girls who grew up sharing a back seat on every road trip to Grandma's house in Savannah ended up on opposite sides of a conference table in a federal building in Atlanta. Dana is 8 years older than me. In our family, that 8 years meant everything. It meant she was always the one who got to sit in the front seat, always the one the adults talked to, like she had something interesting to say. She graduated from Georgia State, got into federal law enforcement compliance before I even applied to college, and by the time I finished my master's at UGA, she had already climbed high enough to look down on most people without even meaning to. I mean, she might have meant to. I'm still not sure. I came into the Office of Financial Oversight through a different door. I built a fraud detection model during my second year of grad school, a system that cross-referenced shell company filings with transaction metadata to flag suspicious disbursement patterns. My thesis advisor submitted it to a federal grant program without telling me. The program director called me before I had even defended my thesis. By the time I walked across that stage with my diploma, I had a GS-12 position and a letter of intent to build out what would become CARAT, the Compliance and Risk Assessment Reporting Tool for the Southeastern Regional Office. CARAT took me 3 years to build. 3 years of 18-hour days, of eating lunch at my desk, of calling my mom on the drive home just to hear a human voice. It was the most important thing I'd ever made. And it worked. It flagged 11 major fraud cases in its first fiscal year. The regional director wrote a memo to DC about it. There was talk of rolling it out nationally. Dana became regional deputy director about 14 months after CARAT launched. I told myself it was fine. We were professionals. We worked in the same building but different departments. She oversaw enforcement and compliance review. I was on the analytical infrastructure side. Our work didn't overlap much. I kept my head down. I was proud of what I built. I should have paid more attention to the look on her face the first time I presented CARAT's findings in a senior staff meeting. It was the kind of look you only recognize later, when you're sitting alone trying to piece together where everything started going wrong. The morning everything happened, I had been in the office since 6:30. We had a cross-departmental briefing scheduled at 9, the kind that gets flagged in the system as mandatory attendance for all GS-11 and above. I thought it was a quarterly performance review meeting. I had my laptop, my updated CARAT summary, a coffee from the place on the corner that always spelled my name wrong on the cup. I walked into conference room B on the 4th floor. People were already seated. I recognized most of them. Analysts from my team, compliance officers from Dana's side. 2 people I'd never seen before who turned out to be from the Inspector General's office, which I did not know until later. Dana was standing at the whiteboard. She had a folder in front of her. She didn't look at me when I walked in. I found a seat near the middle of the table between a colleague named Reeves from Data Architecture and a compliance analyst, I'll call Patton, who had been with the office for about 11 years. Patton was the kind of person who brought a birthday cake for everyone, even people he didn't like. He slid me a small nod when I sat down. Normal Tuesday morning. Dana opened the folder. She said the meeting was being called to address, quote, a critical integrity concern within the CARAT system and the conduct of the personnel responsible for its development and administration. I remember the exact sound the room made, not a gasp. Just a shift. Like everyone exhaled slightly at the same time and then held the rest of it. She said there had been an internal review. She said the review had found evidence of data manipulation within CARAT's flagging algorithm. She said it appeared that certain cases had been selectively suppressed, removed from the reporting queue without documentation, in a pattern that suggested intentional interference. She said my name. I felt something move through me that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was more like the feeling you get when you miss a step in the dark, that half second where your body doesn't know what's happening yet. I said, And I remember keeping my voice very flat because that was the only thing I could control. I'd like to see the review documentation. Dana said the documentation was part of an active integrity investigation and would be shared with me through the appropriate channels. I said, "What channels? There's a process for this." She said, "Yes, and we're following it." She turned back to the room and said that effective immediately, my system access to Karat was being suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. She said the suspension was a routine precautionary measure and did not constitute a finding of misconduct. Then she said that my GS-13 classification was being reviewed for potential downgrade, and that I should surrender my building access credential to HR before leaving the floor. I want to be clear about something. I have a federal employee handbook essentially memorized. I have read it cover to cover twice. Once when I was onboarding and once during a period when I had a supervisor I didn't trust. I knew with absolute certainty, sitting in that chair, that what she was describing was not a legal suspension process. A GS classification review requires written notice, a minimum 30-day review period, and an opportunity to respond before any action is taken. An integrity investigation of a federal system requires IG involvement and documented chain of custody for evidence. The two people from the Inspector General's office were sitting at the end of the table. They were very still. I looked at them. One of them looked down at the table, the other one looked at Dana. I picked up my laptop. I closed it carefully. I put my coffee cup down in front of me like I was setting it on a shelf. I looked at Dana across the conference table. I said, "I built Karat. Every algorithm, every integration, every flagging parameter, every audit log. I know exactly what the data looks like when it's been touched, and I know what it looks like when it hasn't. Whatever your review says, the raw system logs don't lie. And those logs exist in 3 separate places that you do not have administrator access to." The room was completely silent. I said, "I'll be speaking to legal this morning." I stood up. I picked up my laptop and my coffee. I pushed my chair in. And then something happened that I genuinely did not expect. Reeves stood up. He was a quiet man. I'd worked with him for 2 years. He was the kind of engineer who came in, did extraordinary work, and never asked for recognition. He stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked around the table and stood beside me without saying a single word. Then Patton stood up. Then a woman named Sylvie from the data governance team, who I had always liked but wouldn't have called a close friend, pushed back her chair and stood up. One by one, person by person, 14 more people stood up from that table. Some of them I knew well, some of them I barely knew. A few of them I recognized as being from Dana's own compliance department. 16 people total, standing, in a room of 31. Someone near the back of the room said, very quietly, "This isn't procedure." Dana's face did something complicated. I had known her my whole life, and I had never seen that expression on her face before. It wasn't anger. It was something more like recalculation. Like she had run a number in her head and gotten an answer she hadn't planned for. I walked out. The 16 people followed me into the hallway. We stood in the corridor in silence for a moment, and then Reeves said, quietly, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to call legal, and I need you all to write down exactly what you just witnessed, time-stamped, before anyone gets a chance to tell you what you saw." They did. What I didn't say out loud, standing in that hallway, was that I was terrified. Not of Dana, not of the investigation. I was terrified because I had built something that mattered, and I had just watched someone I shared a family with try to bury it, and I didn't yet fully understand why. I understood later. The Office of the Inspector General had already opened a separate inquiry, one that didn't involve Karat at all, that had started 3 months earlier based on an anonymous tip, into a series of compliance review decisions that had cleared several contractors despite flagged irregularities. Those decisions had been made under the authority of the Deputy Director's office, Dana's office. Sixtired had, in its automated flagging, caught 2 of those contractors. The flags had been manually overridden in the system. The override logs showed an administrator credential. Not mine. The federal employee legal team pulled the logs within 48 hours of my suspension. By the end of that week, the suspension had been reversed. By the end of the following week, the IG's office had expanded its inquiry. I was asked to cooperate with the investigation, which I did fully. Every file, every log, every email. I want to tell you the legal process was fast and satisfying. It wasn't. Federal investigations do not move like television. I spent 4 months in a kind of professional limbo where I still had my job and my classification, but didn't fully know what was going to happen to Dana, to the contractors, to any of it. I ate a lot of cereal for dinner during those 4 months. I called my mom every Sunday and told her I was fine. She knew I wasn't. During that time, the 16 people who had stood up in that conference room became something I didn't have a word for. Not allies exactly. Witnesses. Friends. I brought coffee to Patton's desk on a Thursday for no reason. Sylvia and I started having lunch on Wednesdays. Reese sent me a message one afternoon that just said, "The right thing is still the right thing, even when it's slow." I saved that message. My Aunt Dana's mother called me about 6 weeks after the conference room. I hadn't spoken to her since everything happened. She was trying to be gentle, which meant she was asking me to consider both sides, which meant she wanted me to soften what I was saying to investigators. I told her, as kindly as I could, that I hadn't said anything that wasn't true and that I wasn't going to change that. She didn't call again for a while. We got there eventually. Families do. But it took time, and it took honesty, and neither of those things felt comfortable while they were happening. The IG's investigation concluded 8 months after the conference room. The findings were formal and documented. 3 contractors were referred for federal prosecution. Several compliance review decisions were flagged for remediation. Dana resigned before any formal personnel action was completed. I know this because the regional director told me directly. I know the resignation was not entirely voluntary in the way resignations usually aren't entirely voluntary when the alternative involves something worse. I don't feel triumphant about that. I want to be honest about that. Dana and I grew up in the same family, sang the same songs on the same road trips, got yelled at by the same grandmother for running in the house. Something happened to her somewhere along the way, ambition maybe, or fear of losing what she'd worked for. Or something I'll never fully understand, and it made her do a thing that cost her everything. I'm not glad, I'm just clear about what happened and why, and about who I am. 6TRT is still running, an expanded version with a new access governance layer that 3 people have to authorize in order to change any flagging parameter. That layer was my design, built after everything happened, and it was formally adopted into the system architecture with my name in the documentation. The regional director submitted a commendation. The C approved the national rollout discussion. I sat in that meeting and thought about all the cereal I had eaten and all the Sunday phone calls and Reeves's message, and I thought, okay. I still take the same corner coffee shop order every morning. They still spell my name wrong. I have stopped correcting them because at this point it feels like a small, consistent thing in a world that turned out to be less stable than I thought, and I need my small, consistent things. If you had told me, sitting in that conference room watching Dana open that folder, that I would come out the other side with my work intact, and my name cleared and 16 people I trust more than almost anyone, I would not have believed you. But here I am. I keep thinking about the folder, the way Dana set it down on that table like it was something final, something that couldn't be argued with. She had spent a long time preparing that moment, I think. And the part that stays with me isn't the anger I felt, or the fear, it's that I almost let the performance of her confidence make me doubt myself. Almost. That's the thing nobody tells you about being undermined by someone who knows you. They have access to the specific version of you that isn't sure yet. They know where the soft places are. Dana knew I had worked for years in a building where she had more rank, more history, more of a name. She was counting on me to hesitate. I didn't hesitate because I was fearless. I want to be honest about that. I hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. I remember counting, which is what I do when I'm trying not to let my voice shake. And then I spoke because I knew the facts. Not because I felt brave. Because I had done the work, documented everything, built the system with enough integrity that the truth was findable by anyone who looked. Knowing your work thoroughly enough to defend it without flinching. That's not arrogance. That's what you owe yourself after 3 years of 18-hour days. There's a version of this story where I say something more dramatic in that conference room, where I deliver some line that shuts everything down in the moment. That's not what happened. What happened is I said a few quiet sentences and walked out, and 16 people made their own choice. I didn't ask them to stand. I couldn't have asked them. I didn't know they were going to. And that, I think, is the part that means the most to me now. You don't build that kind of trust in a conference room. You build it in 2 years of showing up, being honest about what you know and what you don't, giving credit where it's due, not taking shortcuts when shortcuts would have been easy. What happened in that room was the result of who I had been long before that Tuesday morning. Dana had the rank. She had the title. What she didn't have was the years of small, consistent, unglamorous integrity. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The investigation took 8 months. I ate a lot of cereal. I didn't always hold it together gracefully. But I held it together. Some days that's the whole job, just continuing to tell the truth on the days when it would be easier not to. Continuing to do the work on the days when you're not sure it's going anywhere. Endurance isn't glamorous either, but it compounds. Every day you stay honest when you could have cut a corner. Every day you stay standing when someone with more power is telling you to sit down. It compounds into something that eventually can't be taken from you. Sixterity is still running. My name is in the documentation. The coffee shop still spells my name wrong, and I still don't correct them. Some things you build to last. You just have to be willing to protect them quietly for as long as it takes.